All right, it's 2 minutes past the hour and we seem to have reached quorum, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the IU's B.27 side event. And we're getting started, but before we get started, I'd like to point you to the social media that the IU uses. And please feel free to follow us on our various social media channels. Just a few matters on housekeeping before we get started. Please use the mute button. We request you to use the mute button throughout the presentation part of this session and the parts where you're not speaking yourself. We do urge you, however, to make interventions, to ask questions, make comments, etc. And to do that, you can type your comments and questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and we'll come back to you during the discussion part of this session. We're also on social media. The IU uses Twitter, and our Twitter handle is GCF_eval. Please follow us there. Please tweet about this event and tag us in your tweets. And this Twitter is also used by us for launching our various products, etc. So please follow us on Twitter. And with that, I welcome all of you to the side event where we're talking about the independent evaluation of the relevance and effectiveness of GCF investments in the small island developing states, the SIDS. My name is Archi Rastogi. I'm an evaluation specialist here at the IU, the Independent Evaluation Unit, and I was one of the co-leaders for this evaluation. Today we have with us, we're very fortunate to have with us a panel of experts and authors of this report. So 2 co-authors of this report, as well as 2 experts who will be able to comment on the report from an arm's length. Together, they'll be able to provide us a sense of the findings and recommendations emerging from this report, as well as perspectives from the science, as well as the execution. So let me introduce the panel of experts that we have today. First of all, Dr. Alexandre Magnan, or Alex as I'll call him for the remainder of the session. Alex is a senior research fellow at the IDDRI and is based in Paris, France. He's a senior academic, and much of his research has focused on vulnerability and adaptation to climate change, and his focus has been small islands in the Indian Ocean, especially, and the Pacific. He's also a member of the IPCC and a lead author on the special report on oceans and cryosphere from the IPCC and on the ongoing sixth assessment report. So we'll be able to use Alex's insights from the science, and he'll be able to comment on the report from that perspective. Our second speaker will be NaYeon Kim, Nana, as I'll call her for the remainder of the presentation session. Nana works at the data lab at the IU and was one of the leads for the data for this evaluation. Nana has a master's degree in green business and policy from the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology and a bachelor's of environment science management and policy from UC Berkeley. Our next speaker is Diane McFadzien. Diane is leading the regional desk team at the GCF. Diane is from the Cook Islands herself, and prior to joining the GCF has worked in various national and international capacities, focusing on climate policy in the Pacific. So Diane was served as a national climate change coordinator for the government of Cook Islands. Then she spent time at the WWF International as a climate policy coordinator. And then she was an adaptation advisor before joining the GCF at the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program, the SPREP. And last but not the least, our own Andreas Reumann. Andreas and I had the pleasure of co-leading this evaluation. Andreas is a principal evaluation officer at the IU, currently also serving as the officer in charge of the IU. Andreas has a lot of expertise in designing impact monitoring systems, especially for research for development programs, and also alternative evaluation methodologies. And prior to joining the IU, Andreas was based at the Center for International Forestry Research, C4 in Indonesia. An economist by training, we're looking forward to hearing from Andreas, particularly about the private sector finding and recommendations from this evaluation. Thank you all for your time and your insights, and we're really excited to hear from all of you. Before we go on, let me just give you a quick agenda and the format that we'll follow for the rest of the session. So I'll give you a very quick rapid fire round walk through the main features of the report in the first part of this session. In the second part, we'll be able to hear from the panel and their insights and their comments, etc., on the report's findings and recommendations. And in the last part, We'll open this up to the audience for questions and comments and discussions. So again, please do use the chat box to type your comments and your questions for the panel members, and we'll take them in the latter part of this session. With that, let me give you a quick walkthrough to the status of the report of this evaluation. We'll call it the SIDS evaluation for the remainder of the session. So the report for this evaluation was shared with the co-chairs of the GCF on September the 18th, and it's awaiting board circulation. As soon as it's available, we'll make it available on the website of the IU as well, and the link is on your screens right now. We'll also make it available through our various social media channels, etc., and the IU newsletter, to which you're welcome to subscribe. Now, the substance of the report. What are the key features and the key findings that we had in the report? One of the first things that we found when we started this evaluation was the set of 5 normative values, or 5 factors that are critical to consider for any climate finance institution that's focusing on the SIDS, right? So we found 5 factors that are cross-cutting and that are very important to consider. And the first factor was flexibility. So we found that there's a lot of diversity within a country often, and also among the SIDS, that there is a need to design for flexibility in climate finance approaches when considering the SIDS. The second factor we found, the second normative value that we found was capacity. A lot of the SIDS have low access to human resource, and it's important to consider that in the design of climate finance in the SIDS. The third was urgency. This is quite self-explanatory. A lot of SIDS are facing the challenges of climate change right now, yesterday, and it's very urgent. And the fourth factor that we found important was high transaction cost, which a lot of the SIDS face. And the final factor that we found important was the centrality of adaptation. That in many countries, it was not possible to distinguish between adaptation and development directly. And adaptation remains very, very crucial to climate change action in many of the SIDS. With that, let me take you to the 6 areas of 6 key conclusions that we made in this evaluation report. And the first conclusion refers to the urgency. So we were finding that the GCF modalities and processes are not sufficiently effective to address the urgency of climate action in the SIDS. However, SAP, the simplified approval process, and EDA, the enhanced direct access, do have the potential to address some of the concerns of urgency. On access, we found that the GCF business model, which depends on accreditation, creates disadvantages for the SIDS, particularly for SIDS which have low capacity and experience in the climate finance area. Related to capacity again, we found that capacity to develop concept notes and to develop funding proposals is a barrier in accessing the GCF for the SIDS. The readiness, RPSP, and the PPF, project preparation facility, are not sufficiently tailored to account for the needs of the SIDS. Our fourth conclusion related to adaptation. So the GCF portfolio in the SIDS does prioritize adaptation, and that's great. And it's focused primarily on grants, but it's premature to assess the results of this portfolio so far. And further innovation is possible in the financial structures and instruments of this portfolio. Our fifth key conclusion related to the private sector, where we were finding that the GCF approach to private sector is not sufficiently articulated or coordinated, and is not suitably tailored to the needs of the SIDS and the contexts of the SIDS. And lastly, related to flexibility, we found that the GCF policy landscape has the flexibility to accommodate the SIDS, and that's good. But there are many policies that are pending adoption or decision by the board, and this is quite urgent. Let me also quickly take you through the 4 key recommendation areas that emerged from this evaluation. And the 4 key areas relate to, firstly, the access and capacity. So we are recommending an improvement in readiness program related to access and capacity. So there is the potential to build in for more accompaniment support, more human resource support for direct access entities as well as government entities, and to focus also on regional entities, which emerges quite important for the SIDS, and provide support to them for concept note development, especially. Our second recommendation relates to accelerating and simplifying the project cycle, especially for SAP. Consistent with the IU's earlier review on the SAP, we're recommending the delegation of authority to the Secretariat. And consistent with the IU's review of the accreditation approach earlier, we're recommending that the PSAA, the project-specific assessment approach, should be made faster and streamlined. Our third recommendation area relates to the programmatic approaches, and we're recommending that the GCF board approve a policy on programmatic approaches. And this should include single and multi-country programs and streamline processes so that sub-projects can be approved and can accommodate changes which are tailored to the contexts of the SIDS. And lastly, on the private sector, we're recommending that the GCF approach to the private sector reflects the complexion of the local private sector in the SIDS, and that there should be a coordinated approach across the Secretariat when it comes to the private sector. So with that, a very quick walkthrough, a rapid-fire walkthrough through the main findings and recommendations of this report. I'll now turn to the panel, and let me stop sharing my screen. First in a panel, I'll refer to Alex. And Alex, as I referred earlier, is a lead author on the IPCC report and the latest report, and has had a lot of experience working in the SIDS and researching in the SIDS. And Alex, we'll turn to you and ask you about the chapter that you co-led recently, which talks about the urgency and the importance of adaptation. So we'd love to hear from you some of the insights from that chapter and from your research more broadly. Alex? Alex, you're muted if you're talking.
Yeah, does it work?
It does now, thanks.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you, Archie, for this brief summary of the findings of the report. Just to say that, yes, as kind of introduction from the scientific perspective, this report is extremely important, as each of these kind of reports, of course, but this one is really important because of its geographical scope. The small islands, they are home to 65 million people, and more than 80% of small islands residents live near the coast, where flooding and coastal erosion already pose serious problems. And so they are really experiencing huge adaptation needs. So they are often called among the most vulnerable countries, and for these kind of reasons, that's really true, and that's critical that the international founding agencies support them. And there is, at least when we work with this IPCC stuff, trying to summarize what the scientific literature says, there is a clear consensus on the increasing threats to island sustainability in terms of land, of soils, of fresh water availability, and this kind of important dimensions. And one main reason is that, but it's also true for small islands in general, but especially for SIDS, these kind of territories, they accumulate some features that drive exposure and vulnerability to climate hazards. Well, low elevation, narrow ecological zonations, some very climate sensitive ecosystems, pressure at the coast, and so on. And so there are already, we can see high level of impacts, and this is why it's important to support adaptation now, and massively support adaptation now. So the impacts are detectable today, and they are disproportionately higher in the context of SIDS compared to other kind of context, at least most of the other context, and even in a 1.5 degree global warming world, SIDS will be disproportionately affected. And so we know that, and this is why what Archie, you said about this report is important. We know that risk, current risk, but also future risk will of course depend on the future greenhouse gas emissions and the associated climate changes, yes. But they will also strongly depend on non-climate related drivers such as population movement in risk-prone areas and these kind of things. So the human dimension of risk is critical, and I think the way the report is framed is good to highlight this and to target these kind of anthropogenic drivers of risk. And of course, future risk will also strongly depend on societal efforts to adapt. And again, this is why it's important to support these territories. I had plenty of things to say, but maybe I can stop there. Just so I found the report really interesting and robust in terms of the assessment. And so that's really a good point, and very interesting for me because I'm not specialized. I don't have a lot of expertise in financing adaptation, and so I learned a lot in this report, and it is very clear, and the conclusions are quite robust, I think. So that's a good point. I would just say that maybe something that the GCF should think about is to add a layer of information in this kind of reports relating to the topic of effectiveness, because the report is clear on the trends and opportunities and gaps in terms of how the GCF support help SIDS to build the enabling conditions for adaptation, but we don't have any information, and it's not a criticism, it's just something that could be improved in the future. We don't have really the answer to a critical question, which is, okay, financing flows are coming to the SIDS. There are areas of improvement to make them more effective and so on. But do these financial flows really help reduce risk? So do they really lead to effective adaptation? And this is something we don't have in the report, but it's again normal, because even the scientific literature is not really good at assessing the real effectiveness of adaptation policies and measures in terms of risk reduction. So maybe this is an area of improvement for the next reports. I can stop here, and anyway, there will be some rounds of discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That's actually very important for us to consider. The effectiveness of the GCF portfolio is an important question, at least from the perspective of the IU. But from the science, let me quickly turn to data as well and move to Nana and bring Nana in from the data perspective. Nana, you worked very closely with the data on this report, and very early on, you found that access to data was a challenge. Can you tell us a little bit more about the findings related to access to data, the findings and recommendations?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for some. Thank you, Alex, for sharing your insights. As Archie introduced, my name is NaYeon Kim. With David Huang as a data focal point, we led SIDS evaluation on the data side. So I'll further go into the challenge SIDS faced in getting access to data. And before I go farther, as Alex noted, the challenge for SIDS to get access to data has already been acknowledged by IPCC, as well as very prominent academic journals, as well as institutions as well. So this is no surprise. However, the SIDS evaluation was able to affirm this challenge through several mediums, including virtual interviews, survey analysis, as well as data analysis. So I'll first start with our virtual interviews. So in a lot of virtual interviews, we were able to hear from a lot of respondents how countries struggle to get enough data to meet the requirements for GCF investments. And through every project, they were required to prove and demonstrate the overall national vulnerability to climate change in order to get GCF projects. However, in countries like SIDS, where the capacity is quite low, it was quite difficult for SIDS to go through these hurdles each time. And this led to potential temporal delay, which in the case of SIDS, urgency is quite a big issue. It became a big challenge for the SIDS. So in this regard, we were able to affirm this. And in the survey analysis as well, we were able to find that more than 1/3 of the respondents in the survey actually selected the challenge in the challenge to actually separate adaptation from development as one of the biggest challenge, as a top 1 to 3 challenge. So this, we were able to also affirm that through the survey analysis as well. And lastly, in the IU data lab, we conducted independent analysis where we looked at more than 10 temperature and precipitation data sources, as well as risk and vulnerability indexes to see whether all 40 GCF eligible SIDS were covered by these different data sources. And in our conclusion was not a single of these data sources actually covered all 40 GCF eligible SIDS. So in other words, what this means is in order to compute a single index to show vulnerability of the SIDS, the IU data lab had to merge or had to find other sources to actually come to a single conclusion about an index. So through this, we were able to corroborate the kind of challenge that SIDS could face in getting access to data. And all in all, so one of the SIDS, in the evaluation of SIDS, our recommendation is that barrier to data accessibility should be addressed by GCF through several ways. And one of them could be allowing these countries to actually extrapolate from other sources such as DNAPS, NDC, IPCC, or even the country program to allow them to not get delayed in any ways for the project implementation or design. And also lastly, currently, according to the 2019 APRs, there's only about 8% of activities that is related to data collection. So I believe that this portion could be increased so that the countries are better able to collect data in a long-term plan. So thank you.
Thanks, Nana. You bring up the point about data and generalizability of the data and extrapolation of from one context to the other. And I want to turn back really quickly to Alex once again. Alex, in the scientific community, in the literature, and in your papers also, I've read that you've spoken about things like diverse adaptation pathways and the diversity within a island as well as among the islands. In the literature, in the report, we're making the claim that extrapolation from other sources could work as a source of data. From the perspective of the science, would that be an approach that you might tolerate?
Tolerate. It's acceptable if the rules are clear how you use these different sources of information. But anyway, the starting point, and I think Nana made it, is that we cannot stop thinking about how to help SIDS to adapt and how to found them just because we don't have the data. The data exists, but they are not formalized in the usual way of using global data sets. And global data sets already have their weaknesses and they are growingly recognized. So I think using a set of data that are for sure more realistic because they are coming from the ground is useful and probably a good way. So, but just we have to think about which kind of data we use and how we interpret them, but not stopping at the point that there is no data for SIDS. It's intolerable.
Thank you. So just from data, we'll turn very quickly to Diane then for the execution perspective. So Diane, we've spoken about data and lack of access to data as also a factor in which the experience on SIDS gets distributed across different parts of the Secretariat. You've read our findings and recommendations, Dan, on this and as well as capacity. Assuming that the board and the Secretariat were to endorse all of the findings and recommendations, let's assume for a second, do you think some of the findings and recommendations would, or if the recommendations were actually implemented, do you think they might be able to address some of the concerns of the SIDS in your experience?
Thank you very much for your question, and good evening, everybody. So I work with the GCF in the Division of Country Programming. I'm the regional manager for Asia Pacific. So I'm working quite closely with 17 SIDS in my portfolio, 14 from the Pacific and 3 from Asia. Having looked at the report and looking at the recommendations that came out, I mean, I just wanted to highlight one of the things that really stands out to me first before I answer your question. But one of the things that I think is sometimes not very well understood is the capacity issue with SIDS. It's a very unique type of capacity issue compared to some of the other developing countries that we work in, where capacity in SIDS, we have to remember, is very much influenced by the very small sizes of the populations. So drawing upon examples from the Pacific, working in Niue, which has an entire population of under 2,000 people, and many other countries here have entire populations of up to only 10,000. So when you talk about capacity issues in SIDS, it's not necessarily something that you can solve by putting in additional funds or additional finances, because it comes down to sheer numbers. Just to contextualize that, and some of the direct access entities that I'm working with closely, they literally have units of 2 people. These 2 people already have what you would consider full-time jobs. They are directors of ministries of finance, for example, of a particular unit. They are responsible for all aspects of engagement with the GCF, looking after the legal agreements, ensuring the compliance, the project development, the project design, the project implementation, the project M&E. So they kind of, we're coming at them from all aspects. So simply, providing them with additional resources isn't necessarily going to resolve a capacity problem. And it also has a direct impact on their ability to absorb finances as well. So there's a capacity absorption issue in the region as well. So I really just wanted to kind of pull out what we really mean by capacity. This is not just in the direct access entities, but also in the NDAs. So in terms of your question, should we take on some of the recommendations? I think one I'd like to pull out is providing. So given that SIDS have small populations, SIDS themselves have come up with solutions to this, and in SIDS, the role of regional organizations in particular is a very key one. Regional organizations have quite often been able to supplement capacity, and where a small country cannot necessarily produce data or may not have the technical expertise, these institutions, they've been in the regions for a very long time. They have a mandate that comes ahead of the GCF. They're very familiar with the region, so they understand the context. Where sometimes they have struggled a little bit is they're relatively new to working with the GCF. So they know their region, they know the issues well, but they're still learning the GCF. But one of the challenges that I've seen is the ability of these institutions to access GCF resources, such as the GCF Readiness Support Program, which at the moment is designed in a way that it can only be accessed directly through NDAs. So it's been a little bit difficult. And just, I think, and the other point I'd make, again, coming back to that capacity issue, is, like I said, it's not necessarily about putting in additional resources, it's also about putting in additional people. And what I've really seen when we've seen engagement really take off in a positive way, both from entities and countries, is when they've utilized support, and this has sometimes been from the GCF using the Readiness Support Program, but sometimes also utilizing support from other agencies as well. But when they've used that to embed long-term capacity into their organizations, and sometimes it actually doubles the staff numbers. You're going from 2, you're adding 1, it's already like a 50% gain. And that is something that the GCF definitely has the ability to support and through the Readiness Program, but I don't think it's necessarily well understood always that it's an option there. And from the regional organizations perspective, it hasn't always been easy to access. So I think that's probably the key thing I'd like to say. But I also just wanted to make the comment that for me, this report was particularly useful because the way, currently the SIDS portfolio and the GCF is spread out over, 6 regional desks. So having a consolidated report that brought SIDS aspects into, one consolidated document was very useful. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dan. You raised some very important points as well, and related particularly to the challenge of diversity within the SIDS and how different they are one from the other. And within the portfolio, there's so many differences. We'll come back to that in just a minute. I want to turn to Andreas also and get a sense of the private sector related findings and recommendations, if you might, Andreas.
Sure, Archie, thanks. Thanks very much for that, and actually, thank you for all the participants. It's been really insightful, even in this small round that we have here. As you know, the report is quite has a lot of different information and is quite going into the different fields. One field that we looked at was the private sector. So it actually has its own little chapter in the report that really looks at the private sector. And if you think about the private sector engagement in the SIDS, we obviously had to draw on the mandate and the guidance that comes from the governing instrument of the GCF as well as from the board decisions. So there's 3 points that I wanted to highlight on this. So one is the government instrument clearly says the GCF is there to promote participation of private sector in developing countries. In particular of local actors, those local actors, as also Diane is talking about and saying, we have a very specific context when we're thinking about this. Secondly, the PSF, so the private sector facility that we have at the GCF, is also to support the activities to enable that private sector involvement. That's also very important to know. So that's one aspect as well. And thirdly, the fund is also to catalyze the private sector finance, so the climate finance that goes through public and private, as well as for international and national levels. So when looking at the report and looking at how the evaluation team went about it, it's through the different engagements that we had with the stakeholders, as well as the survey that Nana mentioned, as well as the key informant interviews during our country missions. One, there were several things that really struck very hardly in regards to private sector. One is obviously given the existing climate commitments, public finance and public money is not enough. It can't be done in the SIDS that only the public finance takes care of climate change impacts and adverse impacts that we all have to deal with in the SIDS. And secondly, when looking at the SIDS, and I'll come back to what Alex said, we're looking at a particular vulnerable group, and with very, let's say, risk-averse local private sector that faces significant challenges and risks apparent from climate finance. So when you look at this, you have this dual objective. One objective to raise and catalyze, and one to take care of the private sector in order to build resilience. And here, I think from the perspective from this evaluation, what we found was there's a clear need for a good strategy of how to engage the private sector from the GCF perspective. And when we then look at the Secretariat, we found, and this is again linking very closely to what Diane says, we found that also the conception of private sector as it is right now. So we asked this question to stakeholders inside and outside to say, what is the private sector for you? We found there is not a consistent approach. So there is a conception coming from the private sector facility that does not marry itself to what we're finding on the ground, what is indeed the context that the SIDS are operating in. And those are medium to small size enterprises that, again, as I said, are very prone to risks and have a limited capacity, again, coming to the question of the human factor of the sheer number of people that we're looking at. So it's a very low number, as well as the capacity, the financial capacity to adapt to any risk. So again, from that perspective, one has to say, we also recommended to say, okay, we need further coordination in the GCF across all the different divisions. That means we should start thinking about the private sector at a very early start, and that starts with DCP. And it starts, as Diane said, with the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program. And here we looked at the 83 different grants, and what we found is, so the 83 different proposals, readiness proposals that we have in the SIDS, and what we found is that only 9 of the 83 are actually focusing on building private sector direct access entity, or giving support to private sector direct access entities that are going for accreditation. And that we feel is a clear shortcoming. If we want direct access entities, and access is another issue that Archi has raised as well with the normative values. We see that there's a lot more needed. And then when we look at this question of, okay, there is a capacity concern, and what sort of support can countries get or direct access entities get in order to build such candidates, so pre-accreditation support. And there we found only 2 out of the 83 readiness and preparatory support programs are actually in the SIDS are looking at pre-accreditation support. So clearly, there is a need to coordinate this better and to look at what can we do for the private sector. In addition to this, I only want to make 2 more aspects. Another aspect that came through the stakeholder engagement very strongly is there are obviously different windows at the GCF. You can finance not only through the normal funding proposals, you could also go through what we call request for proposals, so RFPs. And here we have 4 RFPs that are available and that also concentrate on the particularities around the private sector. And here we found, unfortunately, it's a great opportunity. A lot of interest is there, but very few RFPs have actually been found successful. In the SIDS, only 1 EDA, only 1 enhanced direct access, only 1 other one that looks at medium and small size enterprises. So there's an opportunity there that has yet to be fully utilized. And lastly, co-financing is definitely so this catalyzing, as I said in the beginning, catalyzing is an important mandate given by the governing instrument. And here, when we think about co-financing, the private sector facility, it has very low engagement. So we're only talking in numbers, we're only talking about $3 million in co-financing in the SIDS. When we take that in versus the rest of the portfolio, we would look at $2 billion in co-financing. So the co-financing ratios are relatively low when we think about the private sector facility. It's a little bit better for DMA, for the Division of Mitigation and Adaptation. So the public projects also have some engagement with private sector, and there also some engagement with co-financiers from the private sector. But still, it's again, to give you a number, it's around 1%. So it's very little comparatively to all the rest of the GCF. So again, we also think there needs to be a clear idea and a clear key performance indicators for the Secretariat as well as for the AEs to bring forward projects that are more suitable for the private sector in the SIDS, and also take on board a lot of private sector finance and co-finance. So I'll stop here. I know there's a lot of other questions that we'd like to answer, so I'll stop here for that.
Thanks, Andreas. That gives us quite a clear picture going from the mandate on the private sector down to the recommendation that through the findings and recommendations that we're making through the report. The private sector, again, you've brought up the issue of capacity, etc., related within that question, and Orwell also has a comment related to capacity within the SIDS in the Caribbean SIDS specifically, where he's talking about staff of NDA, which cover a gamut of climate change and other matters, and there's just an issue of boots on ground. Some other respondents in our evaluation called it bums in seats, and there's just not enough people to do the work in some of these agencies, and the absorptive capacity as well, which Diane raised as well as an issue in the Pacific, and the support that the GCF can provide to some of these direct access entities. And because we're talking about the issue of access once more, I want to ask Nana about the flavor of direct access that we found in this report, the kinds of entities that the SIDS had access to. Nana?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll kind of give an overall portfolio overview of the DAEs that are available for the SIDS. So for those who are not very familiar with the acronyms we're using, DAEs refer to the regional credit entities as well as the national credit entities. So the regional credit entities can serve multiple countries in the region, and whereas the national ones, they usually serve the country that they are accredited for. So to give a brief overview, there are 13 DAEs that are serving the SIDS, and out of the 13, 4 of them are national DAE. So that kind of already shows you that there's quite a limited number of the DAEs serving the SIDS. So to give kind of overall taste of how the SIDS view the DAEs, in the Caribbean, there has been a, let's say, geographical cohesion in where the countries tend to be more closely collected together in one region. So therefore, of such features, there has been more of familiarity between the Caribbean countries to work with the regional accredited entities. Whereas in the Pacific, because also one of the reasons being the Pacific countries are so scattered across such a large area, there has been less of a cohesion. And so therefore, there has been less of regional DAE working with the Pacific countries. However, I would like to point out one thing, how as Diane pointed out, as Andreas and as Alex also pointed out, about the capacity of the regional DAE as well. In a lot of the regional DAE, there might be often up to 4 people or 5 people serving up to 10 countries or even 14 countries for many multiple agencies, not just GCF. And so although these regional accredited entities have great interest in them to serve the countries, they simply do not have enough manpower to help all these countries at a time. So one of the recommendations the SIDS evaluation brings forward is to actually strengthen the capacity of the regional DAE as well. So that could be more in a long term where the regional DAE could be strengthened via various means, but in a long term. So that's one of the recommendations that SIDS evaluation brings forward, and how the regional DAE is actually such a powerful player in the SIDS and can bring much help as well as support to the SIDS as well.
Thanks, Nana. You've highlighted, for I think, what in my perspective is one of the key findings of this evaluation, the criticality of regional entities as opposed to just direct access entities, but also the issue of regional entities being able to access the GCF because of the complication in getting letters of support from a number of NDAs before they can access readiness support, etc. And Diane, one of the recommendations we're making in this evaluation, as Nana said, refers specifically to regional entities and the provision for maybe a specific window to provide regional readiness support to regional entities and support that focuses on the capacities of regional entities in terms of human resource and their capacity to develop concept notes, because we were finding that to be quite a barrier. In other reports, we found accreditation to be a challenge as well. But in this case, we found that accreditation was a challenge. But once accredited, the capacity to write FPs and to write concept notes was quite crucial as well. Did you have any insights from your experience in the Pacific? And you worked for entities, for 2 at least entities yourself as well. Do you think that if in case there was such support available to regional entities, that could address some of the challenges that they have in accessing the GCF?
I would say absolutely. I mean, I would very wholeheartedly, based on experience, support that. It has been, it's been a little bit frustrating because the countries themselves have very high ambitions for what they want their entities to achieve. I mean, there's certainly, we heard already, there's the urgency scientifically, there's the larger demand, but these regional entities, they're not necessarily large. They don't have large units as such that can kind of meet this demand. And as was pointed out, you have a case of regional entities servicing up to 14 countries, but with very small units of between 2 to 4 people. It's a large task. And while I think for the kind of national entities that are based in countries, there's a high country's ownership over those, and it's been a little bit less challenging for them to kind of come in under the kind of national readiness programs that's been submitted to us. But there's no actual window that a regional entity can go to, which kind of means that they're in the situation where they have to reach out to NDA to be included as part of their readiness cap, as we call it. But politically, that's also, it's quite a difficult sell for an NDA when the NDA themselves has capacity issues, and politically, it's difficult for an NDA to kind of go to their minister and say, we'd like to give, a part of our allocation to this entity, which is not actually based in our country, that is going to service us. So it would just be so much easier if there was an avenue where we could provide that direct support there. And like I said, particularly giving that kind of longer term capacity. Sometimes some of our advisory services are a little bit difficult for these entities to use because, even if you've got access to a technical consultant who can provide you the advice, I mean, like you said, the term, feet in boots or bums in seats, unless you actually have a person who's dedicated and has that space to develop a project from the start to finish, it can be quite fragmented in terms of accessing support. I just want to also say there is a slight difference there. I mean, I'm talking specifically from my experience in the Pacific, but I do know that from the Caribbean, there has been a little bit more success in terms of having the regional entities access the readiness. So I do want to say, like you mentioned, there is diversity. That caveat there. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Actually, in terms of access, we did find that challenge. And I think if you read the report, that makes it, for the audience, if they read the report, that might make it quite clear that while the Caribbean countries have had some success in accessing regional entities, the Pacific less so, but the ACE countries have actually had almost zero access to direct access entities, and only one among the more than 10 countries has access to one regional entity. The others have access only through international entities, and that we found was quite a roadblock for those countries. We also have some comments from the audience, and Josh was talking about saying that most developing countries recognize in their country programs the lack of engagement of the local private sector as a barrier to mobilizing climate finance. And this addresses the question that you were raising earlier. But he also says that they rarely submit readiness proposals to address this issue. What are some of the recommendations in this area directed at the GCF Secretariat, Andreas?
Yeah, thanks, Archie, for giving me the floor here, and Josh Banga, thanks for the question. Look, from the perspective of the SIDS, we have to say we looked at the country programs. They're very few at the moment, and I know you're recognizing most developing countries, but thinking in the SIDS context, we only looked at about 5 country programs that are currently there. None of them speaks on the private sector. So one thing that we, without doing an in-depth analysis, because that doesn't really work with 5 country programs, one thing that we can say definitely is that country programs are important. And in a way, we also recognizing this, and we've had that in particular in stakeholder engagements, that stakeholders said country programs and the idea of country programs need to be thought through again, to say, okay, are country programs actually our roadmaps of projects that we do in the climate space, or are they country programs only directed to the GCF finance? If it is for the entire climate space, we would have to also marry this to a national strategy for financial planning, to really understand of what sort of financial streams do we need. And that speaks a little bit to what Alex was saying earlier. One aspect that we need to understand is how effective are financial flows and how they're going. So that would be on country programs. On the readiness proposals, you're absolutely bang on. What we found is through the analysis of the readiness proposals, we found most of the readiness proposals in respect to private sector would only speak about questions of awareness, questions of training, questions of a better understanding what the GCF is about. And that would be sort of the kind of support activities that are mapped out in RFP, in readiness proposals at the moment. On the other hand, what is less common but more important for private sector are those questions of trying to strategize, trying to plan for effective projects. And secondly, also look at the market mechanisms. So thinking about market activation, as well as building markets to hold the local private sector, and therefore de-risk the environment. And that's again looking at that enabling environment for private sector. So what we found, and this is sort of our key finding there, is that we say there is a maturity gap. So there's a maturity gap between what our PSP proposals are currently proposing to what we actually needing. And what we're actually needing is we need private sector integrated projects, climate projects right now in the city. And that's again speaking to the urgency, while at the other end, we obviously still in our PSP still looking at awareness. And that's not to say that the DCP has failed here. It's obviously clear that our PSP proposals are coming forward from the countries. So it's an identified need from the countries. It's a little bit to do with this question of how can we sensibilize the counterparts in the countries, and at the same time, how can we work on a strategy for the GCF to really look consistently across? And that brings me back to that recommendation that we're definitely making. We need a private sector strategy that goes beyond the private sector facility, but also includes other divisions in the GCF. Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. And this relates to also the question that Orville is raising as well on accreditation, which in his view requires a rethink and a tier structure or a hands-on approach, which is more intimate to guide them through the process. And just the capacity in SIDS DAEs. Also, a question that Orville is raising is the question of the level to which entities in the SIDS are accredited right now, and what is the scale possible, the scale of programming possible with that direct access. I think that, and Peter Weston, ladies and gentlemen, he's also one of the co-authors on the report. And Peter reminds us that a reform in programmatic approach is one of the potential solutions, and one is a recommendation that the report actually makes as well. The report makes a recommendation that the GCF board should approve a policy and programmatic approaches so that some of these single country as well as multi-country projects are made possible. I'll also turn very quickly to the issue of diversity within and among these SIDS, and it's a question that actually Alex addresses in many of his papers. And before we go on, I'll run a little poll by you, and let's see if this might work. Just a poll, and let's see how many of us get the answers right. Which of these countries is not a GCF eligible SIDS? Let's give ourselves, we have 37 folks in the room, and let's give ourselves maybe till we get to about 15. I can see the response is ticking. Okay, so the responses have more or less stopped. I'm going to stop here. Unlike some other election results, here we can get the results of the poll right away. So 67% of the people have voted. I'm going to stop here. And Singapore is not a GCF eligible SIDS. Singapore is actually a GCF eligible SIDS. Madagascar is not qualified as a GCF eligible SIDS. Madagascar is not a SIDS in the GCF in the GCF classification. Let's see a second one. How many GCF eligible SIDS are there? The options are 23, 37, 40, 62. And we have 59% of the participants have voted. 67% have voted, the same as last time, 70%. Well, I get to see how many folks have voted, so it's quite exciting how the results have changed. And I'm going to end now. The majority of participants have responded as 40, which actually is the correct answer. GCF has 40 countries are GCF eligible SIDS. Sorry, let me share the results. And this was the result. 40 is in fact the correct answer. And let me share a third question for our audience here. Of the normative, you should be able to see it on your screens. Of the normative values identified by this evaluation, we've identified 5. Which one is the most important from your perspective? Is it flexibility, capacity, high transaction costs, need for adaptation, or urgency? And We have 50% of the vote. Now we have 60%. And we have close to 70%. 75% folks of the participants have voted. And I'm going to stop in 3 seconds. Okay. This has no right or wrong answer from our perspective. Most participants identified urgency as the predominant, as the imperative normative value that's important in their perspective, followed by flexibility and capacity. And all of these are issues we've spoken of. Let me turn, before we we have a couple of more minutes. I just want to very quickly turn to Alex once again, and the question, and ask him about the effectiveness. And because, and again, from the coming back to the normative values that were identified on the adaptation, on the importance of adaptation, and the importance of effectiveness within adaptation. Alex, would you like to come in and give us that perspective once again that you've identified in some of your recent publications?
Yeah. I think this issue of the effectiveness of what we are doing, either in terms of financing or technical support and so on, to help countries or territories like small islands to adapt is really the critical issue now. I think the adaptation issue is now on policy agendas here and there at the global level also, and we see the importance of the GCF, for example, on the finance aspect. So that's good. That's a progress of the recent years and the recent decades. So good job. But now we have to move forward. And this question of the effectiveness is really critical, because we can spend thousands of billions of dollars in the name of adaptation, but we now need to understand if really we are on track to global adaptation. And so assessing the effectiveness of what we are doing in terms of financing, planning, implementation, and so on, and effectiveness in terms of real risk reduction, because adaptation has just one goal. It's about reducing risks. So what are we doing? What are we financing? And to what extent does it really contribute to reduce risk or to increase risks? Because there are always issues related to maladaptation and so on, depending on what we are doing on the ground. So that would be good if the GCF in particular, but also other founding agencies could move forward on making this link between the portfolio and the risk reduction and the level of risk reduction on the different grounds. And it's critical to understand, why is it critical to understand this effectiveness in risk reduction issue? It's just because we need to understand if we are on track to global adaptation or not. We need to understand the progress made in effective adaptation. And of course, on the financing aspect, this can be a huge contribution to assessing progress globally on adaptation. So that's my final word.
Thank you, Alex. That's actually a very interesting way to think about institutions such as think for institutions such as the GCF. And most of the audience that I can see, I can identify the names in the room are from the GCF sort of sphere. But thank you for talking sense to us almost, from the outside and giving us the outside perspective on that. Dan, before we close, any final thoughts on Alex's comment or any of the other comments we've raised so far?
Nothing more to add from my side, except I really did appreciate the opportunity to kind of participate in this conversation. So thank you. I think there's been some really interesting thoughts shared and a lot of truths in what the findings were.
Thank you, Dan. And we really appreciate not only your contribution today, this afternoon, but also throughout the evaluation as we undertook it. Andreas, any final thoughts before we close from your side?
No, only a reminder. The IU is also bringing to the board an evaluation on adaptation, and that's by the end of the year, and we're bringing it early next year. So we're currently looking not only at the SIDS but across the entire portfolio and in effectiveness of adaptation and what we understand when we think about adaptation from the fund's perspective. So I'd love to see what Alex then says to our second report that comes out by the end of this year. Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. Looking forward to the future. And Nana, final word to you. I want to actually ask you a question as well, Nana. Were there any findings that you want to, if there was any one finding that you'd want the audience to take away with them, any one finding or recommendation? What is your favorite finding from this report?
Well, there are many, but one finding that struck me the most personally was how the SIDS is such a heterogeneous group, and it's so difficult to describe SIDS in one sentence, other than to say it's a group of countries that face very great urgency. However, not all SIDS are getting funding at a consistent level or in an adequate level. As Archie mentioned, AIDS, not only by GCF, but by many climate funds, are getting left behind in terms of the volume of financing. So I thought this was actually one of the most interesting findings that really struck to me, and how important it is to be aware of such fact, and the need for perhaps GCF to look into this area further to ensure coherence and complementarity of its funding. So I think that was one finding.
Thanks, Nana. It's actually from one of the comments, one of the portions from actually one of Alex's papers is that there are SIDS, but not all SIDS are small, not all SIDS are islands, not all SIDS are developing, and not all SIDS are states. So the tremendous diversity in the SIDS can be assessed just from that. And Diane, would you like to come in on diversity as well?
Yeah, just quickly, I absolutely agree with that comment on the diversity. And I just want to make one additional comment, and in terms of because you did mention that some are being left behind, and I'm very conscious that I'm speaking very much from a Pacific perspective, and we have had Orville in the audience, who also manages SIDS as a group as the Caribbean, but there is another group of SIDS in the Indian Ocean who sometimes are a little bit left behind, and I don't think that they are currently. We don't really have that kind of programmatic overview of them. And like I said at the beginning, for me, this report was very useful because it looked at SIDS in totality. There are lessons to be learned across regions. So, for me, it's always interesting to see what's working well in the Caribbean and how that could be applied. But, we do have some SIDS that may feel that they're being left behind more than others. And maybe we've also got to consider the way that we also work programmatically, so that we have more opportunities to kind of have that cross SIDS sharing and think about how we also incorporate that particular group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. That actually that's a very good point for us to conclude this discussion. We're 4 minutes past the hour, and it addresses the questions of access and capacity and everything that we've tried to address in this evaluation as well. So thank you so much, especially to our panel who contributed their time and insights and their keen knowledge to this afternoon, but also actually throughout this evaluation with us. Before we go, I want to also leave our audience with a couple of thoughts from the IU. We are bringing. Let me share my slides. I don't know if you can see them yet. The latest episode of The Evaluator, which is the latest podcast from the IU, is available now. And this latest episode features Dr. Jo Puri, the head of the IU, and an interview with her on the experience of running the IU during her tenure here. So that's available now on the website, and it's a very interesting episode. I urge you to listen to it. We also have a blog post from her and a co-author on designing an M&E system for impact evaluation. And this is really an engaging blog from her. And a new publication is available online as well, which is an evidence gap and intervention heat map, which the IU did in partnership with the German Institute for Development Evaluation. And this evidence gap map and heat map is available online as well, and is quite an interesting read. Refers also to some of the issues that we raised this afternoon. And with that, thank you, colleagues, for listening in. We really appreciate your time and wish you a good evening.